Have you ever felt that there is something inside you that cannot be shown to the world? A dark, untamed side that tries to emerge from behind the masks of everyday life? What would happen if, instead of running from this hidden part, we faced it head-on? Carl Jung, one of the greatest thinkers of the unconscious, once said, "No one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." And that is exactly what we will discuss today. What does it mean to accept our shadow? Society teaches us from an early age that we must be good, just, and morally impeccable. But who defines what is right and wrong? Since childhood, we are shaped to fit within the narrow boundaries of normality while hiding our deepest impulses, desires, and fears. But can we truly live in wholeness while ignoring half of who we are? In the novel Demian by Hermann Hesse, we follow the journey of Emil Sinclair, a young man who, like all of us, grew up in a world divided between good and evil. He was taught to follow the rules, to obey the imposed morality, but something inside him whispered otherwise. Then comes Demian, a mysterious character who opens his eyes to a disturbing truth. The bird fights its way out of the egg. The egg is the world. Whoever wants to be born must destroy a world. The egg is the reality we have been given. It is the system of beliefs we accept without question. But to truly be born as a complete individual, we must break that shell and face the unknown within ourselves. And this journey is not always easy. Accepting our shadow means recognizing our flaws, our repressed desires, our deepest fears. But contrary to what many believe, it is not about becoming evil, it is about becoming whole. Jung called this process individuation, the quest to integrate all parts of the psyche, including those we reject. But before we discuss how we can embrace our shadow, we must first understand why it exists. Why do we spend our lives trying to hide who we really are? From an early age, we learn that the world is divided between good and evil, right and wrong, light and darkness. We are taught to follow the path of light, morality, and social acceptance. Anything that does not fit these standards is rejected and suppressed. But reality is not that simple. Within each of us, there are impulses, desires, and thoughts that do not align with the image we wish to project. And the more we deny this hidden part, the more power it gains over us. Emil Sinclair, the protagonist of Demian, grows up in a sheltered home surrounded by rules and traditions. He believes that the world is clearly divided into good and bad, and that simply following the rules will keep him on the right side. However, over time, he realizes that this division is artificial. Something inside him longs for more, for a truth that goes beyond conventional morality. He feels drawn to a deeper, unknown world. But like many of us, he resists. The fear of confronting this hidden part keeps us trapped in a limited identity. Hermann Hesse brilliantly describes this dilemma. We should not try to correct what we call destiny. Accepting and understanding it is the only way to avoid being devoured by it. Destiny in this context is not an external or mystical concept, but the totality of our being. What we reject within ourselves does not disappear. On the contrary, it grows stronger and manifests in unconscious ways. Fear, anxiety, addictions, and even repressed anger are symptoms of an ignored shadow. Carl Jung was one of the first to study this phenomenon, calling it the shadow. He argued that all the traits we suppress, whether out of shame, fear, or social convention, continue to exist in our unconscious. And if we do not recognize them consciously, they end up expressing themselves in destructive ways. How many seemingly kind and controlled people suddenly explode in fits of unexpected rage? How many sabotage their relationships or careers without understanding why? This happens because when the shadow is ignored, it takes control. Nietzsche warned about this danger when he said, "Whoever fights with monsters should see to it that he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." Repressing the shadow does not make us more virtuous, it only makes us more vulnerable to it. The problem is not having a dark side, it is a natural part of who we are. The problem is denying its existence and pretending we are only luminous and morally perfect beings. This prevents us from truly understanding ourselves and, more importantly, from growing. But then, if the shadow is inevitable, what can we do? The answer is not to run from it, but to learn to integrate it. This means acknowledging our hidden desires, our repressed impulses, our fears, and our ambitions. It means taking control of our own darkness instead of being controlled by it. Most people spend their lives running from themselves. We live trying to fit into standards, seeking acceptance, and avoiding anything that might make us different or dangerous in the eyes of others. But what happens when someone crosses our path and makes us question this illusion? In the novel Demian, this figure is represented by Demian himself, a mysterious young man who challenges all of Emil Sinclair's beliefs and certainties, making him realize that there is a world far greater than the one he was taught to accept. At the beginning of the story, Sinclair is still trapped in what we call the familiar world. He is a good student, an obedient son, and does everything he can to meet the expectations of others. However, something inside him is restless. He feels that there is something more, something he cannot name, but that irresistibly draws him in. This feeling only intensifies when he meets Demian, an enigmatic and self-sufficient young man who seems to see beyond appearances. Unlike everyone else around him, Demian does not accept conventional morality as an absolute. He introduces Sinclair to the idea that good and evil are not separate forces but rather parts of the same whole. This becomes clear when Demian talks about the biblical story of Cain and Abel. According to traditional interpretation, Cain killed Abel and was cursed by God, becoming an outcast. But Demian offers another perspective. What if Cain had not been marked as a punishment, but as something that made him special? What if that mark was a sign that he was different, someone who saw reality in a way others could not? He suggests that so-called sinners are not necessarily bad, but rather those who dare to follow their own path. Hermann Hesse sums up this idea with a striking phrase: "To be born, you must first destroy a world. The world that must be destroyed is not the external world, but the world of illusions we create within ourselves." Sinclair realizes that his life up to that point had been built around a comfortable lie, the idea that he could be only good, only pure, only correct. But real life is far more complex than that. The shadow that Jung described begins to emerge within him, and instead of repressing it, Sinclair learns to face it head-on. Demian is not just a friend, but a guide who leads him down this dangerous path, helping him question the truths he had always accepted without reflection. This journey is not easy. Many times, Sinclair feels fear, doubt, and an almost instinctive desire to turn back, to cling to the comfort of normality. But something inside him refuses to allow it. Nietzsche wrote, "Become who you are." But this doesn't simply mean discovering who we are in a passive way. It means creating ourselves, integrating all the parts that make up our essence, including those that scare us. Sinclair begins to realize that denying his shadow is denying his own existence. What he once considered sin or mistake might actually be an essential part of his growth. The symbol of Abraxas, introduced later in the book, reinforces this idea. Abraxas is a deity that represents the union of opposites, light and darkness, sacred and profane, creation and destruction. He does not choose a side because he understands that both are part of reality. For Sinclair, accepting Abraxas means fully accepting himself. He realizes that he cannot be just half of a human being. If he truly wants to live, he must embrace both the light and the darkness within him. But this acceptance is not easy. What happens when we ignore our shadow for too long? What are the consequences of living an incomplete life, trying to be only what others expect us to be? Most people go through life believing that if they ignore their deepest emotions and least acceptable impulses, they will simply disappear. But reality is quite different. Everything we repress within ourselves does not dissolve. On the contrary, it strengthens and grows in the unconscious, waiting for the right moment to emerge uncontrollably. And when that happens, the results can be catastrophic. Sinclair, the protagonist of Demian, experiences this conflict intensely. Raised in an environment where traditional morality clearly defines what is right and wrong, he tries to suppress any thought or desire that does not fit the ideal model he was taught. However, the more he tries to ignore his own nature, the more disconnected he feels from himself. He realizes there is a hidden part within him, an impulse that cannot be tamed, yet one he fears confronting. This fear of facing his own shadow leads him into deep existential anguish. Carl Jung, who brilliantly explored this concept, warned about the dangers of ignoring the shadow. He said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." In other words, if we do not consciously deal with our repressed impulses and emotions, they will end up controlling us unconsciously. This can manifest in outbursts of anger, irrational fears, self-destructive relationships, or even a constant emptiness that never seems to be filled. This phenomenon can be observed in many people who seemingly lead normal and well-adjusted lives, but at certain moments reveal unexpected and even dangerous behaviors. The man who represses his aggression may suddenly have a violent outburst. The person who hides their desire for freedom may end up sabotaging every opportunity that comes their way. The woman who always strives for perfection may develop anxiety or depression when she realizes she will never be able to meet all the expectations imposed on her. Nietzsche warned about this danger when he said, "Beware that, when fighting monsters, you do not become one." This is one of the great ironies of repression. The more we try to be good, by ignoring our shadow, the more we give it room to take control in moments of weakness. This happens because nothing within us disappears simply by being denied. On the contrary, everything we try to eliminate from our consciousness remains there, accumulating energy and waiting for an opening to manifest itself. Sinclair himself, throughout Demian, begins to realize that trying to fit into a model of purity and obedience does not make him a better person. It only distances him from his true essence. With each attempt to repress his desires and instincts, he feels himself slipping further and further away, and it is only when he starts accepting the existence of his shadow that he finds a true path to authenticity. Traditional morality teaches us that we must suppress everything within us that is considered wrong, but this approach comes at a high cost. Instead of becoming more evolved or spiritually superior, we may end up becoming false, trapped in an identity that is not truly ours. The world is full of people desperately trying to appear good while internally struggling against their own hidden desires. But this battle can never be won that way. Demian teaches Sinclair that accepting one's own darkness does not mean surrendering to chaos or destruction. On the contrary, it means taking ownership of oneself and assuming control over one's life. As he says in one of the most striking passages of the book, you must fully live your truth, even if it is uncomfortable. Only then can you be truly free. But how do we turn this understanding into something practical? How can we learn to accept our shadow without allowing it to take over? If there is one thing human beings deeply fear, it is losing control. Order, rules, and boundaries give us security, making us feel protected in a predictable world. But there is a price for this stability: the repression of our true nature. Everything that does not fit into the socially acceptable image of ourselves is discarded, buried in the unconscious, where it transforms into what Jung called the shadow. The big question is, what happens when we try to live without this part of ourselves? Denying our shadow makes us incomplete, like a bird trying to fly with only one wing. Accepting our wholeness, on the other hand, leads us to the process Jung called individuation, the path of integrating our true self. This process is neither comfortable nor safe, but it is essential for those who seek to live authentically. In the novel Demian, Emil Sinclair begins this journey by allowing himself to question his worldview. Until then, he believed there was a clear boundary between good and evil, but Demian introduces him to a new perspective. The bird breaks out of the egg. The egg is the world. To be born, one must destroy a world. What does this mean? That the world as we know it, the simplified binary version of reality, must be shattered for us to become who we truly are. This process of individuation is not a straight path but a plunge into chaos. Jung said that to become whole, we must confront what we fear most within ourselves. This means accepting our contradictions, our impulses, and even our darkest desires. But acceptance does not mean surrendering to them blindly. On the contrary, it means recognizing them, understanding them, and channeling them consciously. Nietzsche warned us about this necessity when he stated, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." The problem with repressing our shadow is that we end up living mechanically, without a true purpose. Most people go through life following orders, obeying conventions, and avoiding any kind of internal conflict. But is that truly a fulfilling life, or just an existence controlled by fear? Sinclair realizes throughout the novel that denying his shadow only makes him more fragile and lost. When he finally accepts that chaos is part of his nature, he discovers a new kind of strength. But this strength does not come from a constant battle against his impulses. Rather, it comes from the understanding that his light and darkness are part of the same being. As Jung himself stated, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This understanding can be applied to real life. How often do we ignore feelings like anger, envy, or the desire for power, pretending they don't exist? But are these feelings truly bad, or could they, when properly channeled, become powerful tools for our growth? Anger can be transformed into determination. The desire for power can become a driving force for self-improvement. Even fear can serve as a guide to what truly matters to us. The problem isn't in feeling these emotions. The problem lies in denying or repressing them until they become uncontrollable. Sinclair learns from Demian that true freedom comes from self-acceptance. He realizes that he doesn't have to be just an obedient, righteous young man, but he also doesn't need to surrender completely to chaos. The balance between these forces is what makes him whole. In the end, the path of individuation isn't about becoming perfect, but about becoming complete. It's about integrating all parts of oneself without fear or shame. But how do we know if we are ready for this process? How can we begin to accept our shadow without being consumed by it? The journey to accepting the shadow side is not a peaceful walk. It involves questioning everything we have been taught, breaking away from comfortable illusions, and, most difficult of all, looking inward without fear of what we might find. But what makes this process even more challenging is that we live in a world that constantly encourages us to escape this introspection. We distract ourselves with work, social media, and fleeting pleasures, all the while avoiding the only question that truly matters: who am I when no one is watching? In the novel Demian, Sinclair realizes that his growth requires him to embrace the entirety of his being. He must stop dividing himself between the good boy his family raised and the restless young man seeking something deeper. Nothing in the world makes us so indispensable as having to endure the fate that befalls us. This quote by Hermann Hesse encapsulates the essence of embracing one's shadow, accepting one's individuality, history, and destiny without trying to escape from it. Carl Jung said that individuation, the process of integrating all parts of oneself, is not for everyone. It is a path reserved for those courageous enough to face themselves. And that courage does not mean being fearless, but rather continuing despite the fear. Denying our shadow may keep us safe, but that safety comes at a cost. An incomplete life, an existence where we never truly discover who we are. When Nietzsche wrote, "Become who you are," he was not referring to an automatic or comfortable process. Becoming who we truly are demands a constant confrontation with our fears, insecurities, and hidden desires. It requires letting go of the need for external approval and accepting that authenticity comes with a price. Not everyone will embrace your transformation, and many people choose to live on the surface precisely to avoid facing this challenge. But if Demian teaches us anything, it is that this path is worth it. Accepting your shadow means consciously integrating your instincts, repressed desires, and deepest emotions. It means not being a slave to impulses, but also not forcing yourself to be someone you are not. As Demian tells Sinclair, when we hate someone, we hate something in them that is part of ourselves. This reflection shows us that when we reject aspects of others, we are merely projecting our own internal denial. Transformation only happens when we stop running away, when we look into the abyss within us and instead of retreating, take a step forward. For as Jung reminds us, he who looks outside dreams, but he who looks inside awakens. And now I ask you, are you ready to look within? If you've made it this far, congratulations. Not because this video was long or because you dedicated your time to it, but because in some way it means that a part of you felt the need to hear this message. And maybe deep down, you already know that there's something inside you that needs to be understood. I know how scary this process can be. The first time I came across this idea that I'm not just my acceptable version for the world, but also everything I've tried to hide, it was a shock. Because the truth is, we spend our entire lives building an identity that keeps us protected. And when we realize that this identity is just one part of the whole, we feel fear. But that fear doesn't have to be an obstacle. It can be a guide. Because every time we feel hesitant about exploring something, it's a sign that there's something powerful there. So if this video made you reflect, if something here resonated with you, maybe it's time to start this journey. And if you want to keep this conversation going, let me know in the comments. Which part of this video made you think the most? I read everything and I love knowing what impacted you the most. Oh, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. I could tell you that it helps me a lot, and it really does. But honestly, the algorithm doesn't favor those who dive deep into topics like this. So if you want more people to have access to this content, this is the best way to make sure it doesn't disappear into YouTube's void. And if you're still hungry for knowledge, there's a video on the screen that I think you'll like. I can't tell you what it's about, but I can guarantee that if you've made it this far, it has something you need to hear. See you there.